I thought I was obsessed with Obsession before reading the original script. Turns out I had no idea. Obsession is already one of those rare horror films that rewards you with every rewatch. But after reading the original screenplay, I realised some of the biggest secrets in the story never actually made it to the screen. Before we start, there are major spoilers ahead for Obsession, as well as discussions of sexual assault and some disturbing material. This also isn't going to be a plot summary, so if you haven't seen the film yet, I'll generally recommend watching it first, or at least watching a spoiler breakdown because we're diving straight into the details. And one quick disclaimer before we begin. I don't know exactly which draft of the screenplay this is. Film scripts change constantly during production, and Curry Barker himself has said that certain scenes, like Bear and Nikki's car scene, went through numerous versions, so none of this should be treated as the definitive original version of the story. But I still think it offers a fascinating glimpse into what could have been and what was ultimately removed. Because if you're anything like me, Obsession is one of those films that gets better with every rewatch. It took me an embarrassing number of viewings, for example, to realise that the revolver Nikki uses at the end is actually the same gun Sarah's dad keeps in the safe at the music store, meaning Nikki obviously knew the combination all along. Somehow I completely missed that. Also, one fun detail from the screenplay, Nikki is actually spelled Nikky throughout the script, so whenever I say Nikki while quoting passages, I'm talking about, the same character. And the more I read the screenplay, the more I appreciated just how effective the final film really is. In many ways, the movie is tighter, more focused, and far more terrifying. There isn't much fluff and every scene feels purposeful, but at the same time, there are dozens of deleted details that flesh out the characters, answer questions the film leaves ambiguous, and in some cases make the story even darker. So in this video, we're going through 9 things the original script reveals. First, we're looking at Ian and Nikki's situationship, and why I think the screenplay paints Ian in an even worse light. Then we'll talk about Nikki and Sarah's friendship, in quotes, because the script gives us a very different dynamic between the two and makes their rivalry much more apparent. After that, we'll tackle one of the most uncomfortable aspects of the story, why Nikki chose the bear, what consent looks like under the influence of the wish, and why the screenplay makes Bear considerably darker. Then we'll dive into the cat possession theory, because yes, I absolutely have thoughts, and some of the deleted material actually makes the theory even crazier. From there, we'll look at the alternative ending and why I think the final film made the right decision. We'll also cover one of the few questions that bothered a lot of people, including me, why Nikki wasn't treated at the hospital. Then we'll speculate a little bit about the origin of the One Wish Willow and some of the clues hidden throughout the screenplay. We'll finally solve the mystery of what Bear and Nikki were actually doing with Sarah's body. And of course, we'll end with one of my favourite fan theories to come out of this movie, the gender swap CLERK theory, and whether it actually holds up. So grab some food, grab a drink, because this is going to be a long one. We're about to become even more obsessed with Obsession. So I want to start by examining Ian and Nikki's situationship. Firstly because I believe it's key to the story, and also because at the same time it's pretty vague in the actual film. Meanwhile, there are some juicy details in the script that give us a better understanding of the love triangle, or better yet love square, that we get in the friend group. Early on in the original script, during Bear and Nikki's phone conversation right after he discovers his dead cat, the two are talking about trivia night and Nikki tells him that Ian is actually meeting her early at the bar. And Bear is said to be frustrated at the mention of Ian, which to me is very interesting and almost leads me to believe that Bear had a suspicion that something was going on between the two, and that's why he also has no definitive reaction when Sarah later reveals the information to him in the story. Anyways, Ian is purposefully meeting Nikki early at trivia night to essentially cock-block Bear, and yes, I'm presenting that as an actual statement. In the script, Ian sounds a lot more desperate and direct in the way he's trying to set Bear off course and sabotage him. For example, in the scene of Bear driving to trivia night and talking on the phone to Ian after Ian has just suggested that Bear calls Nikki Freaky Nikki, just like in the start of the actual film, Ian says, "Dude, I'm not a dating expert, but I'll tell you this, if you confess your feelings to her like you just did to me, you won't have a relationship with her in any capacity after that." Now that is a crazy ass statement to make, and I feel like that's such a manipulative thing to say and so backstabbing, which is why after I read the script I got a sense of what he's really about and how he's the butterfly effect to the whole thing, which verified my suspicion when watching the film. To me, he was one of the two villains of the story. I was genuinely annoyed, like, sir, no one cares about your trivia night hard on, and neither do you, so at least be a better liar if you're going to try and gaslight 3 people at once. You cannot convince me this guy, Ian, is not jealous and doesn't have feelings for Nikki. Like, there's no way he'll be doing all of this. I think moving the scene about how Ian is trying to talk Bear out of being romantic with Nikki from just before trivia night, as it appears in the script, to the start of the film helps us to suspect Ian less from the get-go in the film and for us to be more oblivious to what Ian is trying to do the whole time. I think it would have been a lot more obvious what Ian was trying to do if it was kept as it was in the original script, and finding out towards the end of the film with Sarah and Bear in the car that Ian and Nikki have been hooking up for the past 2 years on and off ends up being a much more dramatic reveal that we completely didn't expect and just adds to the tragedy of the whole situation. And then we have further details in the script that strengthen this idea of emotional attachment between Ian and Nikki. In the trivia night scene, where the group of friends are sitting down and talking about work, the script reveals an interesting interaction between the two. We cut from Bear to Ian's hand gently resting on Nikki's shoulder in comfort. Bear, disturbed, forces a laugh and joins in. First of all, it's crazy how Bear doesn't have a more obvious reaction or doesn't follow up with Ian after, but Ian's audacity to be territorial like this when he knows the situation his friend is in and has just been giving him advice, in quotes, is pretty diabolical. And while we're on the topic of best friends, let's talk about Nikki and Sarah's friendship, and the single quote marks are very intentional here. So I think in the film there is implied tension between Nikki and Sarah. And I mean outside of the whole wish situation, because obviously the wish is what drives Nikki to be jealous of Sarah and for Sarah to be jealous of Nikki over Bear. It's subtle and not very clear or explored. They sort of come across as regular friends, but in the script the story is quite different. And I want to point your attention to the trivia night scene again, which appears to be quite an important scene, especially in the script. So basically Nikki is explaining to the group about a difficult customer that she faced the same day and how infuriating the experience was, and Ian suggests as a joke that the next time Nikki has a tricky client, she should get the gun in Sarah's dad's safe. The gun is very briefly mentioned in the actual film by Ian and breezed over really quickly, but in the original script Nikki actually has a quite strong reaction to the fact that there's a gun in the store. Nikki asks, "There's a gun?" To which Sarah responds, "Ian, how do you know about the gun?" Ian says, "The other day it was just me and Carter closing and I had to open the safe. There's a tiny silver revolver in there." Nikki asks, "Sarah, why does your dad have a gun in the store?" To which Sarah responds, "Maybe to protect your happy ass?" Nikki continues, "I don't like that." "Here we go," says Sarah. "You know you're 30% more likely to die from a gun accident by owning one." And Sarah says, "You're 100% more likely to die in a gunfight without a gun." And Nikki starts getting a bit annoyed. "And how many gunfights have you been in, Sarah? I need to pee." To which Sarah responds with, "Okay, Karen." And then she turns to Ian and says, "You had to tell her about the gun. I know she's going to make a whole ass deal about it with my dad." To me, this scene is really important as it reveals that there's unresolved tension between the two girlfriends. Nikki comes across as someone who's like super against the ownership of guns, and Sarah finds that annoying, as if Nikki is this annoying goody two-shoes while Sarah is meanwhile described as effortlessly cool in the script. And as the scene progresses, that tension between the two builds up, and of course there's a conflict in their views on the topic, but it also feels like there's more than that. It feels emotionally charged and like there's subtext behind that we don't know about yet. To add to this, in the original script, Nikki is actually not present when Bear and Ian start signaling to each other about whether this moment is the best time for Bear to be approaching Nikki and confessing his feelings. Just before this, Nikki goes to the bathroom and it's just Sarah with them. And while the two debate whether now is the best time to do it, Nikki actually shows up surprisingly and asks what do they need to tell her, to which Sarah says, "Not everything is about you, Nikki." Nikki responds, "Well, I knew it wasn't about you, beer stash." And the context behind the beer stash, by the way, is Sarah was drinking beer and had a beer moustache, which she didn't realise. And Sarah actually ends up being embarrassed while Ian and Nikki laugh. So now we have these two friends calling each other names like Karen and beer stash, which to me solidifies their rivalry and just tells us a lot more about what's going on in the friend group than we actually get to see in the film. And to compare this, in the actual film during the trivia night, the conversation between Sarah and Nikki is also about work, just like in the script, but the sentiment is much different. It appears like Nikki is complaining about an aspect of her job, and then Sarah seems to imply that Nikki is distracted during work, and she may be working on her book while at work. Nikki says that she never works on her book when there are customers in the store, to which Sarah says that she knows, but she's also the one who has to go home and hear her dad complain about her friends all night. Then Sarah asks Nikki if she could pretend that she's working anyway, to which Nikki responds by saying that it's easy for her to say when she's leaving for tattoo school, which I think is basically Nikki saying, I need to work on my future as well, so I have a future. However, while Nikki thinks Sarah has a future together, Sarah confirms that she hasn't even gotten into school yet, after which Nikki apologizes to her and Sarah says to Nikki, I just don't want you to get in trouble, and Nikki says, I know babe, I love you, and then Sarah says I love you back to her. So, as you can see, this interaction is a huge contrast between what was originally in the script and their friendship dynamic. So what does this mean? I think the scene had to be cut short because of timing and just made more condensed, so we didn't get enough time and an opportunity to really explore Nikki and Sarah's friendship and dynamic. And I think what the script does well is set up what comes after. One thing I didn't buy in the movie, despite rewatches, is that Sarah would lie about Nikki telling her she sees Bear as a brother, but having this context makes it more believable to me. And even if she didn't lie, it makes sense why she would mention that to Ian, because she wants Bear and because she sees Nikki as a threat. We also see Sarah in the script being more direct with her affection towards Bear, begging him to stay with her and Ian after trivia night, playfully grabbing Bear's arm, hugging him and giving him a flirty squeeze. This solidifies her attraction to him, and in the montage scene in the script, which is different to the one in the film by the way, but we'll get to that later in the video, when Bear and Nikki are making out in the store, the script says that Sarah is deeply hurt by this. I see questions online and people confused, me myself included, about why Sarah would be so keen to basically force Bear to meet her in the park in the car and to, I guess, confess her feelings for him, knowing damn well what Nikki's current state is and what she just did to herself at the party. Everyone at the party obviously thought she was crazy, including Sarah, so why would you want to meet her current man and mess with her man when you've just seen what she's willing to do and how possessive she's over him? She must either really love Bear and also be obsessed with him in a non-wish way, or there's also a part of her that wants to do Nikki dirty and compete with her and go behind her back because of their complicated and potential relationship as rivals. Or maybe it's both. Now, before we jump into all the crazy shit that happened in the movie, I kind of want to think about Bear's character and his condition in general. I'm assuming that if you were watching this, you've already seen the movie and get the main gist of the story, but I wanted to start by drawing some attention to the first scene in the original script, which actually didn't make it to the final cut. So, writer and director Barker begins the screenplay with a scene in Bear's house in his living room at night. And Bear is just couch rotting and watching TV and thinking about Nikki and how lonely he is and how he wants to romance her but he doesn't know how to. He's so shy, he lacks self-confidence and self-esteem, and he's just throwing himself a pity party. You know, the universal 21st century male experience. So in the script we're introduced to a small old house with faded yellow walls. A tapestry behind the couch serves as a poor man's wallpaper. Ouch, that's one way to call him broke. Bear, 25, slouches on the couch, a depressed existence. He's decent looking but lacks self-confidence. He fixates on a pivotal scene from a classic romance film on a small TV. It echoes, adding an eerie ambiance to the room. The man on the TV says, I've often wondered what it means to truly love someone, and then I realised it's what I feel for you. It's a love that defies the limitations of the world, that remains steadfast even in the face of chaos. Even if the world lost its colour, if hope faded into the night, my love for you wouldn't falter. It's unwavering and enduring, and it fills every fibre of my being. Bear's eyes tell the story of a man who yearns for love but enjoys wallowing in his disappointments. He looks down at the ground in front of him and sighs. Now I see how this scene isn't particularly strong, and I can see why it didn't make the cut in the final thing, but what the script does here is give us a glimpse of his sad existence and how desperate he is for this love story to take shape, how infatuated he is by his circumstances and his shortcomings, and I guess his idea of love or what love should be. And we have this classic trope here that we see in film and television, where an ad or a scene from a movie is played in the presence of a character, and that's supposed to hint to us, the audience, something about the story or reveal something about the character and what their mindset is. In this case, I think this man speaking on the TV is what Bear's aspiring to, and the sort of poetic language and the expression of love that he thinks he needs to show in order to successfully reveal his feelings for Nikki. And of course we see that in the first scene of the actual film in the diner with the waitress and his friend Ian. Though in this case, in the original script, Bear doesn't get publicly humiliated and completely annihilated by his friend in front of a stranger. So why do we care about Bear's sad existence? I think it's important because firstly, this scene reveals the physical state of his world and where he's living and how he's living, but also his mental state, which is such an important prerequisite to what's about to unfold, and perhaps why at the start he makes certain decisions and chooses to ignore red flags, which I do think at the start of the story they can be justified to some degree. But as we move along and as we're about to find out, Bear really had an opportunity to do something right for once, but his desperation, selfishness, and just plain disregard for another human is what makes him the villain, or one of the two villains in the story. And the original script actually is in many ways darker than the film, if you can believe that. So knowing more about Bear's condition, this brings us to the question: when is Bear truly certain of the wish's power, and is it at a different time than in the film? I think the final film makes the effectiveness of the wish a bit more ambiguous than the script. For Bear at least, as us the audience, of course we know that the wish works from the start because we're watching a horror film, right? The script, however, tells us that Bear might have been certain of the wish's effect earlier. In the scene where Bear drops off Nikki at her house, Bear has just made the wish in his car and Nikki returns under the spell of the wish asking him, "You said you had something for me?" And then the script explains, Bear nods, a mix of realization and relief crossing his face. He gets it now. He gets it now, meaning he gets that the wish has worked now, and why Nikki has returned asking him for the gift he had for her, even though she acted weird when she found out that he had it for her. If that's the case, then we can say that this was the moment Bear realised that Nikki was under his spell. For some reason though, I'm not fully convinced that this is explicit here, so we can give Bear the benefit of the doubt on this occasion and look for more evidence. Very shortly after Nikki asks him if he's going to go inside her house, again we get a reflection in the script where Bear looks over to the One Wish Willow in the back of his car that he just used. Again, some could argue that this doesn't explicitly tell Bear that this magical wish-granting tree branch that he just bought from a random shop has worked and the person he's been in love with for almost a decade is suddenly head over heels for him. So let's look at one of the next scenes when Nikki asks Bear to sleep beside her in his bedroom and see if we can find any additional details in the script. So when Nikki starts to undress, the script reads, "This is bizarre, but he ain't complaining." Slowly turning back, he sees Nikki giving him a sad smile. He approaches her gently and softly touches her arm. And let's be real, at this point he's obviously aware that she's not herself or that she's under the influence of something. Let's just say that for some silly reason he isn't convinced of the wish's power yet, and that this must be the effect of alcohol. Bear himself says that she needs to get some sleep and he tells her to take all the space and time that she needs, and the script knows that Bear is troubled by Nikki's request for him to sleep with her. So knowing all of this stuff right, and all this context, I think we can safely say that Nikki is not behaving like herself, and he does know that, but his lust is what's driving him to take advantage of the situation. And to add to this, the script says, Bear hesitates, then sits beside her on the bed, cautious and uncertain of the limits. Now this is key information here because being uncertain of the limits means that he's aware that there are limits. So for him in this situation, it's more about whether it's the right time to cross them or not. And even though Nikki initiates the kiss, he knows that something is very wrong, and of course we see that with the scene that follows next, where as they're making out, the real Nikki regains consciousness over her body and backs away in terror. Suddenly, Nikki opens her eyes to find herself kissing Bear. She recoils in shock, pushing him away with terror in her eyes. And both in the final film and the original script, Bear says to her that he felt like he did something wrong based on her reaction, and he's left very disturbed. Plus, we have the scene the following day where the friends are at work at the store, and after Bear and Ian have discussed the events of the evening, in the script Bear pretends to make coffee while Ian and Nikki are speaking. Quickly, his gaze lands on the unzipped backpack on the table, exposing the One Wish Willow. Realization hits Bear as he looks back at Ian and Nikki. Ian talks, Nikki nods, yet her unsettling smile at Bear remains. And then in the restaurant scene, when Ian calls Bear to tell him about her father's alleged illness, Bear has a realization. Bear's mind goes to One Wish Willow. He can't believe it, but he does. He understands now. Like, come on, he knows at this point, case closed. I believe at this stage we can say that Bear is aware that the wish is working, but he's refusing to face that, and it's also the easier option, the option that's granting him what he's wished for years. But the first night Nikki and Bear spend together also raises something else that we need to talk about, and we can only truly dissect by looking at the original script. Aside from the question of when Bear is supposedly certain of the wish's power, we also need to address the question of choice, or lack thereof. Why does Nikki choose the bear? When does Bear realise that what Nikki is doing, or what wish Nikki is doing, is against her will? And also, what does consent look like in this context? Do you even have to think hard to figure out when something is obviously wrong? You could say that the scene we just discussed is enough to answer the question, but let's take a deeper look. So you know the montage scene in the film where Bear and Nikki are a happy couple doing fun relationship things throughout the whole montage? Well, that's not exactly what happened in the original script. The montage starts with another intimate scene of the two, and is pretty deja vu to say the least. Nikki and Bear are together on the bed, the room bathed in warm colours and shadows. Nikki crawls above Bear and they begin to kiss slowly with intensity. Suddenly, a stark realisation flickers in Nikki's eyes, a silent scream of awareness. She snaps upright as if jolted by an unseen force. Sounds familiar, right? Nikki says, "Bear, what's going on?" Bear scrambles to his elbows, pulling away. "What?" he asks. Nikki snaps back, her fear morphs into a smile. "Nothing." Bear leans back, alarmed and bewildered, unwilling to go through this again. Nikki tenderly draws him back, guiding his hand to caress her face, then down to her chest to between her legs. She moans and they kiss, reigniting their passion as they hurriedly shed their clothes. So not only did the scene happen once in the original script, but basically a second time, and Bear proceeds with it again, even though this time around there's no mention of intoxication and he's allegedly unwilling to go through with it again. Guys, I think we start to pick up a pattern here. Nikki is not making rational choices to have sexual intercourse with Bear, and consent here is super questionable, if not obviously missing. He's ignoring clear signs of her terror, discomfort, and refusing to accept that the only reason this is happening is because of the One Wish Willow he sparked in a moment of complete desperation. Oh, and you know how in the film during the restaurant scene Ian tells Bear that Nikki sees Bear as a brother and she has friend-zoned him? Well, in the script Ian adds that the thought of being with Bear grosses her out. But hey, it actually gets a lot more disturbing than that. Here's how the sex scene after the restaurant plays out in the original script. Nikki slams Bear against the wall, kissing fiercely. They move to the bed where Bear playfully pushes her down. Clothes shed, Bear kisses her neck. Mid-moan, Nikki locks eyes with Bear, her expression shifting to sheer panic. With a frantic shove, she pushes him away and lets out a blood-curdling scream, her body trembling. "Bear, what the fuck?" says Nikki. Bear remains unfazed, his eerie calm demeanour chilling. Within moments, she's back, kissing his stomach. The disturbance registers as nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience to him. Nikki says, "Sorry, baby," to which Bear responds, "It's okay, baby." They finish and Bear rolls over to the side. Bear's smile fades, a subtle acknowledgement of what he never thought he was. Now that puts things into perspective and leaves no doubt on the table that Bear is the villain and consent no longer means anything to him. There's no doubt that at this stage he knows it's not her, and it's such a chilling scene, and his reaction to what he's already used to doing and has started to perceive as acceptable is more disturbing than anything else in the story. This line especially, the disturbance registers as nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience to him. The decision to completely cut this in the film is very interesting, as all the information we can gather from the brief version in the film is Nikki's dissociated empty look as Bear is on top of her, and his conflicted facial expression after they're done, sort of like a really fucked up post-nut clarity. Now obviously I can't say what the exact reason was for cutting this scene out of the original film, but I know for a fact a lot more people in the audience would understand what is actually happening to Nikki and the nightmare she's stuck in. I know there were many people during my Obsession Cinema trips that were laughing during the sex scene and look like they completely missed the point. But on the other hand, I also see how some might argue that showing that may possibly romanticize it or make it less effective / on the nose. Let me know in the comments if you think this part of the script should have been kept in the film. One other thing that was different in the original script was the terrifying go back to sleep scene. Instead of the "I feel like you don't love me as much as I do" and the flower pot scene, Nikki asks Bear to make a deal with her. "Make a deal with me," Nikki says. "What?" Bear asks. Nikki emerges from the shadows, holding a sharp love crystal. Playfully she teases like a child, carving into Bear's arm with the crystal. Nikki, ow! Bear pulls his arm back. Nikki's eyes roll back and she laughs loudly but quickly. Love crystal. Now, I don't feel like this would have been as effective and terrifying as the scene we got in the actual film, but the reason I bring it up is the whole childish persona that Nikki switches it into. Earlier in the script, we're told that it's strange for Bear to see Nikki act like a child, and when she does this, her body language contradicts her personality, and despite multiple instances of Nikki or Wish Nikki embodying this childlike persona which Bear himself finds disturbing and knows that this isn't the real her, he's still proceeding with this cycle of abuse, and I think that's the most terrifying part, and the part that speaks to how abusers in real life actually function, even if they know what they're doing is wrong. One small detail I noticed in the script that really disturbed me is when Bear leaves for work and Nikki is frozen in the same spot for the time being, urinating on herself. The liquid running down her leg is described in the script as staining the floor yellowish red. The yellow colour is obviously coming from urine, but what made me stop and realise that there may have potentially been some kind of force involved in the process was the mention of red staining. And I know this section is getting long, but there's no way we're going to skip over, you guessed it, another sex scene between Bear and Nikki. Yes, after all this, Bear is still willingly being a predator. So Bear and Nikki are home from the party and having an argument about how Nikki is not acting like the real Nikki, and how Wish Nikki can be Nikki, and how Wish Nikki can be Nikki, and anything else that Bear needs her to be. Spoiler alert, she tries to become Sarah. Instead of the disturbing monologue about Nikki ending her life because Bear won't go to bed with her, we get a much more brutal scene in the original script. After Wish Nikki tells Bear she loves him in every reality, suddenly Nikki jumps, startling Bear. We see the bottom of Nikki's legs as she removes her pants and panties. Let's fuck Bear, Bear says confused. Huh? Nikki's bare legs walk off screen. Come on, let's fuck Bear. Bear glances over to Nikki now in the hallway leading to the bedroom. She stands half naked, mostly obscured by shadows. I'm normal, Nikki says emotionless. What? Bear says confused. Hi, I'm normal. Nikki, what the hell? Rail me, Bear, I'm normal. That's not normal. What do you want? Nikki asks. I just want you to not act crazy. Well, if you love Nikki the way Nikki was, Nikki wouldn't have changed for you, Nikki says in a robotic voice. She cracks a broken smile through her wounds. Come on, Bear, rail my guts in like Hansel fucks his sister. Nikki, stop, Bear says scared. She stops. Bear, what's a One Wish Willow? Nikki says sweetly. Bear responds, I don't know, to which Nikki says with no emotion, thank you for showing me that I love you. She grabs Bear's hand and he reluctantly follows. We stay on this empty shot as we hear moaning from the other room grow in intensity. Yeah, so that happens in the original script. Now, I don't know what Curry Barker was smoking when writing this part, and while it would have made for a very interesting watch, I can definitely see why they cut it out and how it wasn't necessary. The point was made already without it. And just to add to the Bear hate train while I can, I haven't seen anyone talk about the pills Bear says he has on him when he's in the car with Sarah. I just know for a fact that he used those pills to drug Wish Nikki so she can stay asleep, and I think that's why the real Nikki managed to actually surface and plead for Bear to kill her while Wish Nikki was knocked out. You could also of course argue that Bear wanted to use the pills for himself after the crazy night they had. But yeah, I'm going to stick with my initial theory, and I think drugging Nikki regardless of which version was out there is still fucked up and adds to the list of Bear's crimes. So to wrap this section up, there's a line from the original script that didn't make it to the final cut and that I thought was both disturbing but also summarised this whole section perfectly. When Bear goes to the shop to buy One Wish Willow again and has an argument with the now male shop clerk who is named Harry, Bear is desperate to reverse the wish and make another one and claims he didn't know about the conditions of the wish. He's very much in denial about this and also the fact that he can't reverse what's been done to Nikki, to Sarah and to himself. And that's when Harry hits him with the line, "You knew. Even if you didn't know, you knew." And in the words of Nikki, profound. And the next thing I'm very passionate to talk about, and it's not just because I'm a cat person and I was pissed off at Bear because of how he treated his cat, but we'll get to that in a second. So you may have heard of the cat theory in Obsession being discussed, where basically the idea is that Bear's cat Sandy possessed Nikki after dying. And let me start by saying that yes, I do believe in the cat theory as an alternative explanation to the story, but I think possession isn't the actual explanation of the story, and saying that it is would ignore a lot of the difficult and important topics the movie explores. Still, I think the cat theory works more, or potentially may make more sense to the non-believers when looking at the original script rather than just the actual movie. No idea if that makes sense, but basically I was obsessed with the movie Coraline when I was younger, and that movie had so many different theories and explanations for what happened, and ever since then, every film that can be interpreted in different ways gets my attention and respect. And listen, there are plenty of valid reason, in my opinion, for the cat theory, and it certainly makes for an interesting analysis. So grab some cat snacks, or Sandy might come and scratch your eyes out while you're sleeping. Let's start by looking at the script to find some clues about how Nikki's affectionate behaviour can be explained as being possessed by Sandy's spirit. When Nikki first arrives in Bear's house, she's struck by something. Both in the script and in the movie, she says his house smells nice and like him, and she finds comfort in that. And cats rely heavily on their sense of smell to interpret the world, right? Familiar scents act as chemical reassurances, telling them that their environment is safe and that they belong in that territory. Nikki is entering a completely different environment, as it's implied that this is her first time visiting his new place, or what was his grandma's. Yet she feels so comfortable and safe in what appears to be a familiar environment. You could argue that's just the Wish doing his job, but you could also argue that Sandy's spirit finds its way back home, a place where the cat spent most of its walking life, and a place Nikki increasingly tries to get Bear to spend more time in. Nikki's or Sandy's clingy behaviour when she wants his attention is also very reminiscent of a cat. And you know which scene screams Nikki is possessed by Sandy's spirit the most? The scene where Nikki stands in one place for the whole time while Bear is at work. If we assume that this is Sandy's spirit, the poor cat is waiting patiently for her owner to return as he's away for long periods of time, all alone with nothing to do. And I'm sure you've heard of cat separation anxiety, which is a behaviour stress response triggered when a cat is separated from its primary caregiver, who is Bear. And listen to this, one of the symptoms of cat separation anxiety is inappropriate urination. And what does Nikki do on the floor when Bear leaves? That's right, she urinates. If the cat was potentially his grandma's, which is never specified by the way, the separation anxiety could make even more sense because his grandma is no longer living in the house and all Sandy has is him. To come back to the film for some help with the theory, when the camera pans to the mess Nikki has left on the carpet while standing in one place, there is literally cat food that she had vomited. Why else would Nikki eat cat food? Another symptom of cat separation anxiety is excessive vocalization, such as constant crying or meowing while you're away or as you prepare to leave. And what are Nikki's reactions whenever Bear tries to leave Nikki? To go to the toilet, to go to work, or to go to Ian's party without her? Yep, excessive vocalization. You guys are getting where I'm going with this now, right? Clinginess and pre-departure anxiety are also listed, as the cat is said to be following you from room to room whenever you're home, or hiding and sulking when you start your routine to leave. And I'm on a roll here because another symptom is anxious greetings, which are explained as extreme frantic excitement or clinging behaviour from a cat when the owner finally returns home. Coming back to the script, what is Nikki's reaction when Bear finally returns home? Nikki springs at Bear, hugging him eagerly like an excited dog. Now yes, the comparison is to a dog, but I think if Curry Barker said cat here, it would have been too on the nose, and he wouldn't do that, would he? Another small detail that struck me is when Bear asks what happened to Nikki after seeing her covered in sweat and bodily fluids. She says, "I think I ate a bug. I mean, got a stomach bug." Or both. And who would eat a bug or say that they ate a bug if they could speak other than a cat? And what would be the most logical way to correct yourself in human terms if you're Sandy the cat and you've just basically exposed yourself? You say that you have a stomach bug. You could also focus on aspects of the film to explore the theory further, such as Nikki hiding in the corners at night and watching Bear sleep, her strange elegant movements, her glowing eyes in the dark, as well as the tabby cat logo on the One Wish Willow box. To try and be more objective, I see how a counter argument could be that Nikki is simply mimicking Sandy's behaviour because Bear showed he was grieving for the cat, but I can only somewhat see that for Bear in the film only. Bear in the script to me shows no concern or empathy for Sandy and discards his pet like a piece of trash. Nikki never sees him show any type of strong emotion for Sandy in the script because, as he says, it hasn't hit him yet. And one of the reasons I said the script may support the cat theory more is because there's also, interestingly, no cat sandwich scene in the original script. Why would Sandy's spirit make Bear eat its flesh instead of cherishing it, which Bear doesn't do, and actually he disrespects the cat's body, which leads us to the next part of the cat theory. For some context, the bear we see in the film is a guy who's a lot more empathetic towards Sandy than the bear in the script, although his actions in the film towards the cat are still questionable. In the script, Bear doesn't appear to care about the cat's death at all, and he seems to be completely unbothered by the accident. Instead, he's much more fixated on the fact that he's hopelessly in love with Nikki, which I think is what's made him so selfish and ultimately caused the cat's death due to negligence, a common pattern we find with Bear. And as mentioned in the previous section, the original script starts with a different scene than in the film. So as Bear's watching TV and contemplating his depressed existence, he happens to look down and away from the TV only because he's feeling defeated. It is only then that he spots Sandy dead on the ground. He looks down at the ground in front of him and sighs. In the center of the room, a dead cat lies where the coffee table should be. Its body is stiff and the grease from its hair has begun to seep into the carpet, causing it to smell. Bear takes a deep breath and finally stands up. Pay attention to the language Curry Barker is using here to illustrate Bear's emotionless reaction. Bear sighs when he sees Sandy's dead body, as if it's just another inconvenience to add to his list. Sandy's body is already stiff and has started to decompose, and he's just now noticing it, even though he's been in the room for God knows how long. In fact, this may not even be the first time he spots Sandy being dead, but he's finally now deciding to do something about it due to the smell and the staining. And listen, even if this happens to be his grandma's cat, what he's doing is not normal at all. And then Bear enters the kitchen and finds on the tile floor a straw basket, pills, and candle wax from a shattered candle. Bear scoops the pills back into their bottle, reluctantly. Another inconvenience for him. This is the part that annoys me the most because I think he was present when the cat knocked over the pills and ingested them, but he was too careless and fixated on his sad life to even check what happened. Like, there's no way you're not going to hear a candle shattering and check out what the hell happened unless you are Bear. When he's done putting the pills away, he shuts the cabinet and looks at himself in the mirror. He tests out a smile. Eerie. What a weird thing to do, and you could argue that people deal with grief differently, but he clearly didn't care about Sandy in my opinion. So what else does Bear do? He then puts Sandy in a trash bag and drops the now heavy trash bag into a trash can. Like, what normal person would put their dead pet in the trash? And we all know that not treating the dead with respect and care always leads to bad things, especially in horror narratives. And Wish Nikki herself, or Sandy's spirit if you're on the same page as me, also finds Bear's action questionable despite her otherwise preoccupation with Bear only, and how he can do no wrong in her eyes because of the wish. As in the film, Bear wakes up to find an unusual memorial of his cat made by Nikki, but in the script we get more of Nikki's perspective in the situation. Nikki says, "I'm sorry, I found the body in the trash. I didn't think that was proper, Bear." My question is, why would Wish Nikki care about Sandy's body and how Bear sent the cat off to the afterlife, unless there's a possibility that Sandy wanted him to face his actions through the facade of the girl he loves so much? Nikki then asks Bear, "Do you want to say a few words and then I can clean this up?" Bear responds confused, "He was a good cat." Yeah, that's all he has to say. Also, Sandy being a male in the original script is not what I imagined. Sandy to me has feminine energy, but I think that doesn't change anything. Then Bear says, "Nikki, this is weird." And Nikki gets defensive and asks, "Weird?" She adjusts herself as if she's offended by the remark. She picks up the stiff dead cat with one hand and tosses it in the garbage, a hint of attitude in her action. Nikki continues being defensive and says, "You threw him in the trash, Bear. It's not cool." Thank you, Nikki / Wish Nikki / Sandy. This is what he needs to hear. Ultimately, this scene and the previous examples reveal how Bear showed no regard for Sandy, and regardless of whether you believe the theory, the neglect for the cat to me is very reflective and foreshadowing of his neglect to Nikki later in the story. And this brings us to my explanation and rationalization of the cat theory and the vengeful Sandy spirit that possesses Nikki. When Bear wished for Nikki to love him more than anyone else in the world, Sandy's spirit felt abandoned and disposable. Why couldn't he wish for his cat to come back to life instead of wishing to spend all his time with someone else? He chose Nikki over his cat, which angered Sandy's spirit, and the wish was twisted so that he gets what he wants with Nikki, but with the condition of having to face the wrath of his deceased cat. And what better person for Sandy to possess when the opportunity presents itself than Bear's childhood crush, his romantic ideal? It's the perfect revenge story. And yes, I'm jumping through hoops to make this whole cat theory happen, but let me know what you think of my delusions. Do you believe in the cat theory? Now, before we look at how the ending has been changed from the original script, I do wish to say that I think the ending in the final version of the film is perfect and should be protected and untouched. However, who doesn't want to know what other options there were on the table, am I right? So, apart from Bear wishing that Nikki didn't love him while she's still in the room with him, and Nikki swallowing the joint she was smoking while pretending to be Sarah, the ending in the script develops pretty similarly to the final film, up until the point when Bear is dying from the pill overdose. But right at the end, the original script gives us an alternative ending for Nikki. So as Bear is slowly dying, Nikki's like, no, 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 what did you do, baby, no, similar things to the final film. However, as Bear is dying, he just manages to say his last words very weakly. He says, in this life and the next. And the script says, these final words hit Nikki. She takes Bear's gun and with finality shoots herself in the head. We remain fixed on this shot, capturing the blood slowly dripping, a haunting and sober testament to this tragic love story. Okay, so a lot to digest here. Firstly, it's interesting how in the movie Bear doesn't say the line, in this life and the next. In his final moments in the script, Bear is still infatuated by the idea of this grand love story or romance with Nikki that he saw on the TV and the first scene of the script. Whereas I think Bear in the actual movie is much more shaken by the consequences of his actions, and he accepts defeat and is empty inside with nothing final to say. There's nothing more for him to say or do. So for Bear, I'm a fan of both endings. In the script as this anti-hero with an extreme and distorted understanding of the hopeless romantic, and in the film as a flawed and insecure man who accepts the tragic and he led himself to. As for Nikki, this is a horror film with actual substance, so of course Curry Barker won't let Nikki have peace in the afterlife, even after everything she's experienced. Death would be peace for her, but in true horror tragic end fashion, and also Final Girl style, Nikki is to face the consequences of what a man has done to her against her will. She'll either make a killer villain in a spin-off, expose the One Wish Willow magic and write a New York Times bestseller, or be locked in a mental asylum for the rest of her life with no true memory of what it feels like to be yourself ever again, or hope that true romance ever existed. Which one do you think is most likely? Or there may technically be a way out for Nikki from all of this. So keep watching because I'll come back to this a bit later in the video. And after reading the script, I did come across an interview with Curry Barker where he mentioned that he was really obsessed with this Romeo and Juliet ending. But apparently his dad and a few other people around him mentioned that leaving Nikki alive was more disturbing if she basically survives the whole thing. And he sort of agreed and switched it around. And Curry Barker actually shot both endings, the one where Nikki dies and the one where she survives. And the exciting news is that we may potentially be seeing this other ending, as depressing as it will be, but I'll come back to this at the end of the video. I know for a fact that I'm not the only one who was wondering why Nikki wasn't treated at the hospital after the self-inflicted wounds she suffered during the party. Well, guess where we can find the answer? Yup, the original script. After the real Nikki desperately attempts to get help again during the party, or tries to end her misery by bashing her head with a glass. On her way to the hospital, she's clinging on for dear life, according to the script. And once at the hospital, from afar we see Bear and a nurse try to get reluctant Nikki out of his car. Nikki pushes Bear off of her, refusing to go. Bear pulls the nurse off to the side. While they talk, Nikki gets out of the car and begins to do a little dance. The nurse ultimately refuses to take Nikki because of the principle of informed consent. So what can we tell from this? Nikki is referred to as reluctant, meaning she's refusing to be treated at the hospital, right? Even if Nikki was resisting, I think it only makes sense for a rational person to continue trying other ways or means of getting help for someone that you allegedly care for. Now, I don't know what Bear would tell the nurse to make her not be suspicious and for her to not pursue other methods, such as calling the police. And this very well may be commentary on the American health system, but given her delirious condition and significant bleeding, it doesn't make sense to me that the nurse would let this go. The key way in which this is justified in the story is what the script is referring to as the principle of informed consent. Informed consent is the ethical and legal right of a patient to make autonomous, self-directed decision about their healthcare. So there's a bit of suspension of disbelief here, where we have to assume that because Nikki was proactively refusing to be treated, then that's the reason she wasn't admitted. And again, we have this idea here of illusionary consent, where Nikki appears to have agency over decisions that affect her. But as we have seen, that's not the case, and what truly is best for Nikki is clearly not on Bear's priority list. I do want to note that one of the conditions of informed consent is competence/capacity, which means the individual, in this case Nikki, must possess the mental capacity to understand their condition, weigh the risks and benefits, and communicate their decision. And clearly Nikki was in no state to do that. That's what makes the whole thing a bit unbelievable, but I'm assuming the main rationale behind the decision from the production is that a film in a hospital scene would have increased the budget significantly, and for a low budget production like Obsession, that does matter a lot. On the other hand though, I do think they could have worked around it creatively and just cut from the party to a scene where Nikki has already been in the hospital and been discharged, but it's not a big flaw and I'm happy to look past it. Now, I want to make something clear first in this section. I think one of the huge appeals and the reason why Obsession is such a great story is because it doesn't focus on the origin of the One Wish Willow. It doesn't try to explain where it comes from, how exactly it works, what it means, or what exactly the rules are behind it. What is the logic? What are the consequences? All of that is left to our imagination and is exactly why the story works so well, and I think it's so cool that Curry Barker left those details out that would have just made the story so generic. In an interview with Collider Interviews, Curry Barker talks about the story of the One Wish Willow, or lack thereof, and explains that going too deep into it would get people bored quickly. Barker says, "I know there's some crazy lore behind it, but it's almost not my job to figure it out." And the actors of Bear and Nikki have also said they didn't explore the story of the One Wish Willow, and both agree that focusing on its origins wasn't of interest or necessary. And in another interview that I can't recall who with, Curry Barker essentially said that it's up to the fans to come up with the story behind it, and that their interpretation would be more interesting. Well, let's do a bit of that then, shall we? If we were to theorise, again mainly drawing from the original script, there are some clues that can actually help us figure out a tiny bit more about what's going on and where the One Wish Willow may come from, and the world or alternate reality that exists alongside it. In the script, the box of One Wish Willows are placed on a lonely shelf which is aged and has an out of place appearance, and there is a sign that reads, "Grab your One Wish Willow, only a few scattered boxes remain. They're the size of a toothpaste box, featuring a design reminiscent of a classic 1950s toy package." Now this tells me two things. One is that potentially the One Wish Willows can be traced back to at least the 1950s, and they certainly have a history to them. The description of the shelf and where they're placed also gives them this antique and haunted feeling that could be explained with some kind of simple lore. The second thing is that clearly other people have been using them, as we come to find out from the seller herself. And if you didn't know already, Barker has said that he has ideas for a follow-up to Obsession in the form of an anthology series to continue the One Wish Willow universe, where essentially each episode will explore a different wish gone wrong, and we could only hope for more of this quality storytelling. But what it does, I think, is confirm this idea that the One Wish Willow is a rare item and has a history, likely a very dark and disturbing past. And in the script, Viola the clerk says to Bear that they've been popular since they've been brought out, which to me says that they may have started being on sale very recently. This may also explain why we don't hear about any other stories of other people using them. Their wishes are likely still in the process of being fulfilled and going totally wrong. Or their wishes are taking place in different alternate realities, but we won't be opening that can of worms today. And further into this scene in the shop, which appears to have been cut in the final film, Bear jokes about the origins of the wishes and their credibility by saying, "And I'm guessing these just came in this morning, mysteriously." To which Viola responds with, "No, we've had them." A very blunt and deadpan answer that tells me she's serious and also knows a lot more about the One Wish Willow than she's letting on. And then Bear continues to tease the clerk by mocking the cursed item / archetype object with powers, which are reminiscent of, the monkey's paw and the genie in a bottle. He says sarcastically, "They've been here forever, no idea who supplies them." To which Viola gives some context by saying that the wishes were recalled in the 80s. The 80s make so much sense, doesn't it? And that the shop has held on to them. Not gonna lie, I would have loved to see some vague references to wish cases in the 80s, or something subtle in the script or film, just enough to tease us a little bit. In the script, Viola also asks Bear if he wants to buy 2 wishes because there aren't many left, foreshadowing the wish going wrong and signalling again that she knows more about it. Are there really only a few left? What do you think? The box of wishes in the movie looked pretty full to me, so I wonder why that has also changed. I think what Corey Barker does here is show self-awareness of the wish trope, and he pokes fun at it with the audience, but again, the dialogue likely got cut out in the final film to make the story and flow more concise. The scene with the male clerk is also interesting as it has a few differences in the script, again with more detail for us to engage with. One thing noted in the script is that when Bear returns to buy more One Wish Willows, there are only 3 left and he buys all 3. Why is this an important detail, you may ask? Firstly, I'm suspicious of the clerk, and I think he also, just like Viola, knows more than he's letting on. I think there were exactly 3 wishes left intentionally for Bear to pick up. Remember a minute ago I mentioned how Viola tells Bear to grab 2 Wish Willows, as there aren't many left? Well, isn't it suspicious how there were still 3 left when Bear came back after quite a bit of time has passed? I don't believe that no one bought any in the meantime, as Viola notes that they are popular. Or was she just saying that to convince him to buy them, to make a wish? Does the One Wish Willow rely on victims to sustain itself and the shop clerks are just the messengers? Well, my theory is that Bear unlocked an alternative reality where the One Wish Willow did exist, which links to the Mandela effect mentioned in both the original script and the film, and that the shop clerks are part of the whole scheme. There are references to multiple realities, for example, Nikki saying she loves Bear in all realities, and there's a lot more to explore with this idea of the Mandela effect and the suspicious shop clerks, but I'll save that for another day. And I did say I'll come back to the ending of the story in the previous section. So, 3 wishes left in the end, right? 1 wish was for Ian, who blew it. The second wish, which Bear tried using himself, despite the 1 wish per person limit, and he couldn't break it. And then the wish Nikki used to wish Bear loved her as much as she did. But if Bear never managed to break the Wish Willow himself, then that Wish Willow was still technically unused. Hi, editing me here. So before something happened to the audio, what I was trying to say was that technically Bear's wish was unused and was left for Nikki if she wanted to use it in the end. But because she already used her wish on Bear to be obsessed with her, she would need someone else to wish for her. And the wish she would make can be to forget everything and to ensure her innocence. So that was a potential ending that popped in my head and something I was thinking about. But let me know if you think it holds any weight. Let's talk a little bit more about Sarah and what the hell happened to her body and what the hell Bear and Nikki were doing with her. I'm not gonna lie, even after seeing the film close to 10 times, I was still confused every time, and I would specifically look for the scene where they were transporting her body and I'm like, where is this location? Is this in like a butcher shop or the music shop? If it's the music shop, why would they take her there? Wouldn't there be cameras? And why are they taking her body from her own car to the place, and then where is the body going in? And what does Nikki mean by saying to Bear that Sarah's body is ready? I know I'm not the only one who was wondering this, so it took actually looking at the script to figure out what the hell was going on. Here's what the script says. Nikki exits the store with the giant tuber case. Bear and Nikki fold Sarah's naked body into it, adding sandbags. They place her in the trunk of her SUV. Bear re-enters the store, leaving Nikki alone with the body. She glances inside to confirm Bear's distraction, then back at the body, up to something. And I was like, oh, that makes sense, but at the same time, I was like, they're putting her body in a fucking music instrument case from the music store she works at and the music store her dad owns. That's so fucked up. We can, I guess, assume they turned off the cameras, or maybe the store didn't have a budget to keep the cameras running, I don't know. I'm also guessing the sandbags are to make the case weigh more in order for them to dump her in a body of water like a lake or an ocean, we're not really given details of the location the film takes place in, and we don't see much of the outside world, but I feel like that was the initial plan, or the plan Nikki wanted Bear to believe was the real one. Then we find out that Nikki is wrapping the case with Sarah's body inside with tape, but she stops abruptly. And I think she probably stopped because she realised she will need the body later for her grand plan in the ending. And I do have to say, I'm glad I read the script, as it scratched an itch that the film couldn't, but I can't say that I feel any relief about what happened to Sarah after her death. Now, to end on a bit of a more light note, a fun little theory emerged online about the gender swap of the clerk, and I was invested and thinking of ways that I could see how that worked, and I made sure on my rewatches to look out specifically for this. Now, you might argue that this is just fans doing too much and milking the movie to oblivion, but let's just have some fun for a second. Essentially, people were speculating online that the female shop clerk that we see at the start actually used the wish herself, and she wished that she was a man, so the man that we see later on in the film is the lady but post-wish. And I myself couldn't pinpoint a similarity between the female and the male clerk in the script or the movie, aside from their mysterious nature and the fact that they both know more about the One Wish Willow and sort of selectively choose what to reveal. So in the original script, the clerk Viola is described as a 29-year-old hipster right out of Woodstock, while Harry is a 34-year-old oddball. I don't think Viola would age herself by 5 years on top of the gender swap. And the shop in the script is described as a mum and pop shop, which according to Google AI overview is a small independent family owned business. And it originates from the idea of a self-employed husband and wife couple running a store. This may very well mean that Viola and Harry may actually be husband and wife, or brother and sister, which would be a fun little nod to Hansel and Gretel again. And they just sort of alternate working shifts. So I'm afraid I'm not so convinced on this one. I mean, you could also speculate that Viola and Harry exist in two completely different realities and Bear is just jumping through alternate realities. Or we're just jumping through hoops at this point, so maybe it's time to wrap it up. And after going through all of this, I think my biggest takeaway is just how much respect I have for the final film. Because while the original script contains a lot of fascinating ideas and some scenes that are genuinely wild, the movie constantly proves that sometimes less really is more. A lot of the cuts make the story tighter, more tragic, and honestly more terrifying to me. At the same time though, I love that these deleted details still exist. They don't replace the film, but they give us another lens through which to look at it. They answer questions, create entirely new ones, and make rewatches even more rewarding. And that's probably why Obsession has stuck with so many people and with me. It's the kind of horror film that invites discussion. You finish it and then immediately want to go back, compare scenes, argue over theories, and ask yourself whether you missed something. Personally, I don't think I've become any less obsessed with Obsession after reading the screenplay. If anything, I think I've become worse. And I don't have anyone to talk about this film with, so now I want to hear from you. Which changes do you think improved the film? Which deleted scenes should have stayed? And do you buy the cat theory, or have I finally lost my mind? And if Curry Barker somehow ends up reading the comments, please give us that anthology series. Until then, I suppose we'll just have to keep doing what Obsession fans do the best, obsessing over Obsession. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Action.
You were supposed to kiss me. I'm like a bird. Oh my god.